OverSoul 7 and the Museum of Time by Jane Roberts. Published by Princeton Hall in 1984. Read by Martin John. Dedicated to OverSoul 7 in all his manifestations, and to all those who take the codicils to heart. Chapter 1. Cypress and OverSoul 7 look in on Dr. George Bainbridge and friends. "I don't like doctors," OverSoul 7 said to his teacher, Cypress. The two of them were small specks of light on the front second-floor window of the small medical building. "This doctor is one of your own personalities, and he needs your help," Cypress said, sighing. "Souls aren't supposed to be prejudiced." With that, the window flew open. A man in a medical white coat stuck his head out and started shouting at the pigeons on the small roof just below. "Beat it! Beat it!" he yelled, and the window slammed down. "He needs help, all right," Seven said morosely. "Is this an exam?" "Exactly," Cypress said. "And you're going to be his new associate. You're going to adapt a physical body of your own for a change, and—" "Never!" OverSoul 7 yelled. "It's a necessary part of your education," Cypress said gently. "You have to get closer to Earth reality now to really understand your personality's experiences. You knew it had to happen sometime." To comfort Seven, Cypress turned into the image of a lovely young woman of ancient knowledge and of an ancient woman with young appearance. Seven disconsolately turned into a 14-year-old boy. Both of them perched invisibly on the upstairs window sill, above the medical center's circling paths. "This is really asking too much, Cypress," OverSoul 7 said. "Your personalities are physical all the time," Cypress reminded him. She tried not to smile. "How long do I have to have a body?" Seven asked. "Why, just until you help Dr. Bainbridge with his problems." "How long will that take?" Seven asked. His image blurred around the edges, and Cypress answered, "Who knows? That's up to you." "What is his problem?" Seven asked uneasily. "That's for you to discover, too," Cypress replied, looking nowhere in particular. "It will be readily apparent, though." "I'd rather help Maha in the land of the speakers," Seven retorted. "Her life is exotic. Or Tweety's, growing up in the 17th century. Now, they need help too. It seems that I have more personalities than I know how to handle. And worse, you keep introducing me to more all the time. I didn't even know I had a doctor personality." "You knew," Cypress said, meaningfully. And OverSoul 7 blushed. "Well, all right. I knew and forgot. I mean, I thought he was doing all right." "You gave him his life and energy," Cypress answered, "and I know that you sustain him at one level. But you do need a follow-up." "It makes sense," Seven said, in a dejected tone. Then, hopefully, "Can't I just help him from here, though?" Silence. "I really have to take on a body for a while, not just an image?" Silence. "Digestion, breathing, all that?" he said almost despairingly. "All that," Cypress said. "Well, all right. for variety as long as I have to do it. I'll be a woman in the day and a man at night. Or I'll be an Indian on Thursdays, a Greek on Mondays. One body, Cypress said emphatically. A man or a woman. Take your choice. But you have to keep one body just like humans do, at least for this part of the examination. It has to be over 21 to, say, mid-20s for this particular assignment. OverSoul 7 was suddenly overwhelmed by the implications of the situation. I'll have to live someplace then. I mean, find a domicile or house, as it's called here, and wear clothes. Go into stores to buy them. I'll have to relate to people. I mean humans, as if I were one of them. He closed his eyes, so agitated that he changed into several images at once. Now stop that, 7, Cypress said quickly, and do settle down. It's not all that bad. Not all that bad? 7 was astounded now, growing more upset by the minute. Helping my personalities out in the dream state, giving them inspiration, sustaining their lives is one thing, but joining them is something else. Now he looked like an old man, head bound with a turban, ancient and rickety. Pathetic image, Cypress said, smiling. Do I have to be born? 7 asked. Nothing would surprise me now. No, there isn't time for that, she said. You'll just appear. Well, that's something, 7 replied, a bit mollified. I mean, birth implies such a commitment. Then, as an afterthought, he asked, what kind of doctor is Bainbridge, anyhow? A surgeon? General practitioner? A neurologist? He's a dentist, Cypress said. A dentist? I dislike dentists most of all, 7 cried. They're butchers. In the 12th century, a visit to the dentist is practically a death sentence in just about every country in the world. The same applies to the 17th century, for that matter. Once my personality, Joseph, almost died in a dentist's chair, though it was a filthy stall more than anything else. And Dr. Bainbridge lives in the late 20th century, Cypress said. I've checked medical histories in connection with time periods just to make sure you'd have the information you'll need. In this era, dentists are very, very respectable, and they are not considered butchers. They still pull teeth out, OverSoul 7 said, shivering slightly. They don't use sound to dislodge them yet, or to heal tissue, or... Cypress couldn't help smiling. See, you know a lot more about dentistry than you realized, she said. Come now, let's take a look at Dr. Bainbridge. He's treating a patient inside. This is the Community Mental Building Psych Center of Riverton, New York. George works there 3 mornings a week. Psych Center? What's that? 7 asked. You'll find out. Watch, Cypress answered. At first glance, George hardly looked predisposing. He was stocky, brown-haired, with a flush face and large lips and, 7 noticed, lots of white teeth. Haven't done any work on your teeth at all, have I? Well, today we'll take care of that, George Bainbridge said and laughed. Up in the chair there. Verily, said the patient. Verily, replied George, who was busily rearranging his tools of torture. Thought Seven to Cypress, who stood to one side, invisible. The institution attendant, Miss Much, leaning against the door, said, "This one thinks he's Christ," and lifted her shoulders. She was dark-haired, full in body, motherly. George grinned at her and said, Oh, his appointment card says John Window, but that's okay. Here we go," he said to the patient, who was now ensconced in the dental chair, his undistinguished face surrounded like a halo by the swivel lamp that glared almost in his eyes. "It's the molar," George said. "Just a little nitrous oxide here," he added more to himself than the patient. Then, "That's laughing gas. You won't feel a thing." He got out the round canister from his bag, saying, "You just squeeze this. You can regulate how much you need. If anything begins to hurt, squeeze. Got it?" He was peering into the patient's face. Some could regulate their own doses and some couldn't. "I think you'll do okay," he said. The patient's brown, curiously warm and deep eyes stared into George's. "I'm Christ," the patient said. "I can stand a little pain, or perhaps I won't feel any at all. I'm never sure of my reactions. Gas won't be necessary, though." The attendant moved slightly forward. OverSoul 7 groaned mentally. But with only an instant's silence, George went right on talking as if he were used to having Christ in his dental chair all the time. "I'm not allowed to take out teeth without anesthetic," he said, "and Novocaine is a step up. Like this takes too long. So why not humor me and take the gas? It will make things a lot easier all around." A pause. Then Christ shook his head. "Verily, do as you want, then." "Super, super," George replied, rubbing his hands together. "Now see how this works." George demonstrated while the patient hesitantly took a few whiffs. "Heavenly," Christ said. OverSoul 7 felt uneasy seeing the man in George's dental chair, his face brightly lit in George's lamp, his mouth now open as George peered inside. "Take another sniff," George said. Christ complied. He smiled and began humming, "Nearer, my God, to thee," as the gas took effect, so that George had to tell him to stop again. "Wider," George said. Watching the procedure, Seven winced as George's pincers came down upon a bicuspid in Christ's lower jaw. George applied pressure, pulled, and he had the tooth in his hand. "There, you did great. Super. There's the bugger," he said, showing Christ the tooth. Christ was still under, smiling, and for a minute George Bainbridge stepped back in surprise. He'd never seen such a brilliant, uninvolved, innocent smile in his life. The patient was in his 40s, yet right now his eyes looked like a boy's of 10. No, George thought, he had a kid of 10, and the kid never looked like that innocent in his life. "Bless you, Christ," the patient said, in a voice so particularly sweet and whining that George just stared, still with the tooth in his hand, bloody roots and all. And as the patient spoke, George Bainbridge felt his whole body suddenly, unaccountably become warm and tingly. It felt glowing, pliable, filled with strength, as if he himself had become younger in the flash of an eye. Automatically he pushed a square of white gauze into the hole left by the tooth, and swabbed out the blood in the patient's mouth. All he could mutter, again automatically, was, "Super! You did super!" In the meantime, OverSoul 7 stared suspiciously at Christ. "He always blesses everyone," said Miss Much, the attendant. She shook her head emphatically. "Never causes any trouble." George just nodded, trying to act as normal as possible. It was the gas, he decided, that gave the patient such a sublime expression. He was euphoric, for God's sake. Nothing mysterious about that. Except that George was feeling euphoric too. And he hadn't taken anything. Didn't even get a whiff. And how could you explain that? "You can get down now," he said, after checking the hole in Christ's gum. It showed slightly, and he said, "We'll fill in that hole somehow. Don't worry." Christ spat out a little more blood and hopped out of the chair as agile as a boy. He paused, turned to George and said, "Bless you again, my son," and made the sign of the cross. And this time George just stood transfixed. He literally felt as if his entire body had been tuned up, adjustments made here and there, circulation quickened and cleansed, as if he'd been breathing pure oxygen for years. Despite himself, the words were out of his mouth. "How do you do that?" he sputtered. "I'm Christ," the man said, gently enough. And though George reminded himself that this guy was some nut in the mental institution, the words made sense. Not sensible sense, George thought, but some kind of sense. Miss Much chortled, "He gave you the whammy too, huh?" Her broad face looked amused but kind. "Suggestion," she said. "Amazing, isn't it?" "I'll take a shot of that any time," George said. He made a long, drawn-out whistle and watched with unaccustomed awe as Christ waved goodbye and went out the door. "Ciao," George said. George took care of several more patients, but he didn't joke as he had earlier, and he forgot to say "super" to encourage his patients and reassure them. Everybody wanted to be a good patient, after all. But George was upset about the Christ patient, and he wasn't sure why. And that worried him. It was okay to be depressed because, say, a tooth hurt, so you had it pulled, or your blood sugar was down, or someone said or did something to anger you, or somebody rubbed you the wrong way. Like this guy, George thought glumly. Because the patient, a young man named Gregory Diggs, was staring belligerently into his eyes. "Open up further, please," George said, and he took a good look at the man's face just before he slid his gaze to his open mouth. "Feel this?" he asked, tapping, exploring the gum tissue. "You had a wisdom tooth out at the reformatory." He bent back up. It's your gums, not your teeth, I'm afraid. Hurt quite a bit sometimes, don't they? Yeah, drawled the young man angrily. He scowled resentfully. How'd you know? The gums tell all, said George, washing his hands. They never lie. They're falling apart. They're... Shit, they are! You just want me for more appointments. You'll probably pull every tooth in my head just to make a few extra bucks. George had almost forgotten what was bothering him, but the young man's defiant, scornful glare brought it all back, because George instantly compared that hateful look with the forgiving yet childlike clarity in the eyes of his earlier patient. The exuberance he'd felt when the nut first blessed him had vanished. Naturally, George thought, with irony. But his unusual state of being, that had always been A-OK, now seemed drab and dull by contrast, as his whole body were full of Novocaine. Well, demanded the young man arrogantly. Hell, I pull teeth just for the fun of it, George said. How come you're here? The dumb bastards want to find out if I'm crazy or not. Are you? George asked. I think everybody is crazy. Can't say I'd suggest gum surgery. Don't think it would do any good. The young man said, You mean, if I had money, you'd do it, don't you? George had it. He stepped back, hands planted on his hips. I'll take every tooth out of your head right now if you want me to, George said, with a forced laugh that was half joking menace and half real dismay. What the hell was wrong with guys like that? He wondered. Then, the condition of your gums is so advanced that I don't think you can save the teeth anyhow. I'm trying to save you some pain. Gum surgery is no picnic, and I doubt that it would help in your case. The teeth are loosening. In about 3 months or so, we can start taking them out, and I'll give you a bridge for a while. Shit! I'm not going to be here any damn 3 months, Gregory Diggs shouted. You're a crazy man. In 3 months, I'll be long gone one way or the other. He started to get out of the chair. Have it your way, George said, and he shrugged his shoulders, because he couldn't get through to this kid at all. And, he told himself, he should have known better than to try. Yeah, well, you done with me? Gregory Diggs asked. I got an appointment with my banker. He grinned, got out of his chair, wiggled his backside defiantly, and headed for the door. Super! Enjoy yourself, George said dourly. George began cleaning up his equipment and packing up his instruments in his small bag. Still watching, OverSoul 7 said, even though he's in an institution, that Gregory worries me. I don't mean to make too much of this, but, well, he couldn't hurt George in any way, could he? Remember the existence of probabilities, that's all, Cypress said. I wanted you to have a good look at your personality's life and work before you're introduced into his environment. And the Christ character, 7 said, people who think they're Christ worry me too. You never really know what they're up to. I still don't see why George was so upset when he felt better. You will, Cypress replied. Worry about that later if you must. Right now I want you to have a look at George's establishment. George is spending the afternoon and early evening at the cottage with his wife. And as soon as Cypress spoke, she and Seven were in George's downstairs offices several blocks away. Pay particular attention to the layout of the house, Cypress said. The family rooms are upstairs, for example. You're supposed to meet George for the first time for dinner at 8. Why should I pay particular attention to all that? Seven asked. I sense some implications or complications. But Cypress was gone. Uneasily, OverSoul 7 looked around. Though everything looked normal, the rooms had an unsettled quality, a shifting or impermanent feel, as if they had only just taken their present form the moment before he arrived. Seven sighed. Despite his odd premonitions about the house, his first duty was to look it over, and then to meet Cypress so they could settle the question of what kind of body he should take. Seven whiled away the time by trying on various images for size, though he didn't thicken them into bodies, mostly because he didn't know how. The time passed so quickly that it was evening before Seven realized it. And George, he thought, should be home at any time. He decided he'd better look the house over as Cypress suggested. He went into the next room. Just as he did, he took the immaterial form of a young man in his late 20s, the approximate age he'd appear in his physical body, when he got one. It was then he realized that something wasn't right. Everything was blurring, as if either time or space were being squeezed out of shape. End chapter 1.